Well, welcome everyone, and God bless you on this Thursday night. So blessed to be a part of your lives and your you with me. And I think this is it the 12th or the 13th? I think it's the 13th. So March the 13th. That's what happens when you're retired. You don't look at that calendar every morning. But anyhow, it's Thursday, March the 13th, and we're going to be diving into Genesis. And last week we read the first part of Genesis 37, and most of it was regarding Joseph. We're moving from Jacob being center stage to Joseph, and we'll continue with that for most of the rest of the book of Genesis. Now we're going to take a side road here in 38, and I'll talk more about it when we get there. But this chapter started with Joseph being 17, and this whole period of time he's 17 throughout this chapter and the next. And we see that the relationship with he and his father had, that he was the favorite son, and how his brothers didn't like that. Joseph didn't made no bones about letting everybody know, made him the coat of many colors, the cloak of many colors, and the brothers ended up being very envious of him. And the envy worsened when Joseph disclosed two of those dreams that he got from God. They were both godly dreams, but there seemed to be a lack of wisdom in when and how he shared them with his brothers. But those dreams are going to come to pass. But they hated him even more because they put him in a superior position. Even his dad and mom were put beneath him, which his dad kind of questioned about it. But his father pondered it because he knows how God works, and he's had a few dreams himself. So Joseph's brother hated him, and they plotted against him. Their first plan was just to let him throw him in a cistern and let him die. But then Judah didn't want to see that happen. And there was an opportunity to avoid that because there was a caravan passing by. And so they agreed to sell him to the Midianites who were heading to Egypt for the going slave rate of 20 pieces of silver. So we take up with the record in Genesis 37, verse 29. If you'll take your Bible, if it's an REV or whichever Bible you use is fine. It'll just be a little bit different if you're not using the REV, and that's okay. So Genesis 37, I'm going to share my screen so you can actually read it on the screen if you prefer. You see here, there. And I'll be using commentary from several places. Of course, the Revised English Version commentary, which is a free version online. You can get that pretty easily. And there's other commentaries on the internet, as well as the commentary by Dennis Prager. He has a lot of good things to offer. So we start up here in Genesis 37. I just told you in verse 28, the Midian men who are merchants passed by. The brothers pulled him up out of the cistern, drew Joseph out of the cistern, sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. Now, when Reuben returned to the cistern, now it seems like some of the brothers were there to take him out, but Reuben wasn't. Most likely he was watching the sheep. You know, they had a ton of sheep and they were way up north. So somebody had to keep an eye on them. Probably several brothers did. And behold, he went to the cistern. Joseph was not in the pit, so he tore his clothes. He was pretty upset about it. And he returns to his brothers and he said, "The child is no more. And where am I to go?" He was kind of beside himself because he's the oldest and he's the responsible one that's supposed to take care of these kinds of things. And here he is, he's lost one of his dad's sons, his brother, which was the son of Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife. We know that Joseph was the son, his son to Rachel, and then his youngest son, Benjamin, was also to Rachel, and Rachel died in childbirth. So he tore his clothes, which was common. And we're going to talk about tearing of clothes a little bit later on. This is a common thing. It's in the New Testament and the Old Testament. When someone was distraught, they're really upset, they tore their clothes. That didn't mean they ripped it from top to bottom, but they put a tear in them. And so he's really distraught. So they took Joseph's tunic. This is part of their plan here in verse 31. So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in blood. Now, these guys are kind of smart. They took a male goat. They're not as valuable as a female because a female can, add to the flock, and also they produce milk. So they took the male goat, got the blood, and went from there. Now, an interesting parallel that Prager brings up is that the goat meat, if you recall, we went over this not long ago, when Rebecca and Jacob were conspiring to trick Isaac, she went out, they said, slaughtered a couple goats. And that was to be disguised as Esau's couple of wild game that Isaac liked so much. So here we see Joseph being deceived by goat as he deceived his father. Now his sons are deceiving him. The significance of it is interesting, but that's what happened. In the goat meat and the goat blood, here we got it. Then they took the multicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Please identify it, whether it is your son's tunic or not." Well, we know that when that happens, that means, you've heard parents, they get mad at one of their kids or kids misbehave, and they'll tell the other spouse, "Do you see what your son did?" That still goes on. So anyhow, they still showed their disdain and hatred for Joseph when they were bringing this thing to him, which they knew it was just going to tear their dad up because he was the favorite. And will you identify it? Of course he's going to say it is. It's just kind of bizarro. But here we go. So they took it, and that's what happened. He says, well, he identified it, and he said, "It's my son's tunic." Oh, and then he draws these conclusions. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is torn to pieces. So he draws those conclusions, and they're not accurate, but he believes them because as you read the record, he never holds Joseph's death against the brothers. He never says anything about it. He just goes into grieving. And so in verse 34, I think most of our group is familiar with this custom here that I'll read. So Jacob tore his clothes. So we got a lot of clothes getting torn here. Reuben and now Jacob, and he put on sackcloth on his waist and mourned for his son for many days. So Jacob showed his grief by doing this. And there's a lot of records in the Bible that deal with this. It's a familiar custom, but I'm going to go through it a little bit in more detail because some people that are watching or listening to this video in the future, they may not be as familiar with it. The custom was widely practiced, and it was a sign of grief. It could be mourning, anguish of some sort. We see in the Gospels, God gave a specific commandment. Now, we see it in the Old Testament, but in the Gospels, we see where the priest did not obey it because the commandment to the priest was that they were not to tear their clothing. Now, this was an exception for the priest because what they were wearing was so sacred, they were not to tear it. However, if you remember, the high priest did when he got so angry at Jesus for saying he is the Messiah. So he ignored God's commandment and tore his clothes anyhow. However, it's a very common custom throughout the Bible, and we can take a look. I'm going to have you turn to Acts chapter 14. We're going to move away from Genesis here for a few verses, and we're going to look in Acts chapter 14, and we're going to get to verse 14, but I'll just give you a little context here. Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra, and they come across this crippled man, and they heal him in these verses. And then in verse 12, they call Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was before the city, brought oxen, garland to the gates. He also, with the crowd, was wanting to offer sacrifice. So they get so excited and worked up, they're going to sacrifice to Barnabas and Paul. And guess what they do? But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard it, they tore their clothes and rushed out of the crowd crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things?" So here we see a record of, it wasn't grief, but it's more of just anguish and being disturbed by their behaviors. They were so not wanting to do this or treating them as gods, and they were just human beings. And so you can read the rest of the record, but you get the gist of it. The focus here is on tearing this, and was what happened. And of course, most of you, I think, would probably be familiar with Job. I'm going to flip over to Job here. You can join me in Job chapter 1, verse 20. This is after Job hears of the so many things that were occurring. The everybody, the kids were getting killed, the livestock, he was just losing everything. And in verse 20, then Job arose and tore his cloak. He shaved his head, dropped onto the ground and worshiped. And so he showed his. So, and Job is one of the oldest Bible records, books of the Bible. So you can see it was pretty common, and it's being done then, and also way back then too. So let's go back to Genesis in chapter 37 again. We'll take up in verse 35. All of his sons and his daughters. Well, wait a minute. Daughters, plural? Okay. Let's think about it. Remember the daughter? Her name was Dinah. So what's the daughters, plural? So time has passed here, right? Joseph is now 17, and that means his older kids are quite a bit older. So it could be that he had daughters-in-law, and it could be that he could even have granddaughters. So we're not thrown by this, I mean, saying this is a mistake in the Bible. It's just as we open our understanding to, there could have been other daughters outside of just natural born daughters to Jacob. So this is what we think. Could have been daughters-in-law, and we could have been even granddaughters to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He said, no, I will go down to Sheol to my son mourning. And his father wept for him. So Job is beyond condolences. He is deeply grieved because this was his favorite son. And, you know, anyone who's lost children, it's got to be a horrible, horrible thing. That, and this being his favorite son, and thinking that he was killed by a wild animal, could have had a miserable death, was just devastating to his loving father. So he wept over him. And you notice here, he says, I will go down to Sheol. This is very interesting because Jacob had thoughts and understanding about what happened when you died. It doesn't say he went to Hades or he went to heaven or he went somewhere else. He didn't say he was going to heaven or anywhere else. He just said Sheol. Now, Sheol is a Hebrew word. It's a Hebrew word, and it's brought forth in the Hebrew text because there's really no English word that really describes it. The best words are probably gravedom, the state of the dead. But the problem came up when the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Bible, then the Old Testament, because as you know, Alexander the Great conquered Israel back in 300 and some odd. And they wrote the Septuagint, I think it's around 325. I'm not sure the exact year, BC. So what is happening is that the Greek language was coming into, I think that was BC. You know, I have to check that out to be sure. But the deal is Greek did not have a word for Sheol. The closest thing that they had was Hades. And that's what you see so much in the New Testament, Hades. They go to Hades. Now, Hades carries a lot of baggage with it because the Greeks believed in an immortal soul. And any of the writings, I think Milton and others wrote about Hades, devil being red with pitchforks, and people, if they were bad, that's where they went. So this whole concept of Hades was translated into our Bibles. Instead of just thinking when you die, you're dead, the thing was brought in that you really aren't dead and you go to hell if you were a bad person. So it would have been better in the Septuagint if they just transliterated the word or just used the word Sheol because there was no good word. And so now we have dealt with centuries of misunderstanding because of the mistranslation of that one word. So let's continue. Meanwhile, while Joseph is weeping, the Midianites sold him, Joseph, to Egypt, to Potiphar, an officer, the captain of the guard. So that's what we're going to take up here. But I just want to, before I skipped ahead of my notes here. I want to go back just a second because some of this stuff is important. The place was called the Lake of Fire. There is a place called the Lake of Fire. And this is what people get mixed up with Hades. There is a time coming when there will be a lake of fire. My understanding, this lake of fire is started after the tribulation, because the first record of it actually being put in use is when the Antichrist and the false prophet that gets so much writing in the tribulation, they are thrown into the lake of fire. Now, the adversary is not down there with the pitchfork. Nobody's in there. And it's just called the lake of fire. Sometimes it's called the Gehenna. And this communicated well to the Hebrews because the Gehenna was right out on, I think it was the south side of Jerusalem. It was a valley of Gehenna, which means it was owned by a guy named Gehenna. And so they threw their trash there. And seemed like there was constant burning, and things would eventually burn up. They'd throw their trash, and actually they even threw people there that could not be buried. And so you have this Gehenna, which was always burning. And now in the Bible, we have this lake of fire. Sometimes the lake of fire is called Gehenna. So the false prophet and Antichrist go in to be destroyed. How long it takes, we don't know. And also there is the gathering of the people after the battle of Armageddon or Har-Megiddo, if you want to go back into the Hebrew. The survivors, the non-Christian, non-believing survivors that were on earth after that survived the battle or didn't fight in it, whatever, they're gathered together and then they're judged. And that's called the sheep and goat judgments. The goats, the unrighteous ones, go into the Gehenna, the lake of fire, and they burn. And so the lake of fire is started up at that time. It does not exist now. There's no record of it existing, but it will be a futuristic way where God punishes the evil. And that'll go on. And the last we hear of the lake of fire is at the end of the 1,000-year millennia, when the adversary and his demons are thrown into the Gehenna, and that's when death is destroyed. So that's the last record that we know of that. But that helps you with Sheol, where the dead people go, Hades, which was a bad translation into the Greek. But the reality is, and their similarities, is what I just told you. So that's important. Okay. Let's go on to where I wanted to go here. Back to Genesis 36, and we'll continue. And I just read that to you. So Potiphar, what an interesting name. So Potiphar buys Joseph. And it's kind of interesting. It looks like God had his hand in this because Potiphar is a captain of the guard. So we don't know exactly what that means, but that's where he went. It was a difficult situation for Joseph because he's now a 17-year-old kid becoming a slave in a foreign country, away from his dad and his brothers and his sheep, and now he's been thrown in this situation. But the good thing is he's put in with a person that has some standing. He has a position in the Egyptian government. Pharaoh probably knew him. That'd be a good assumption because he was head of the guard. So we can see God's hand in this, even though it was a difficult situation for Joseph. And God's got something in mind here. And this is one of the things that's so amazing about God. You give God time and he can work through the most difficult situations. His goal right now is how do we get to the Messiah? I have made certain promises that I am obligated to keep, and I will keep them, but I have got to get to the birth of Messiah. And I got to protect this bloodline because I've said he's going to come through Abraham. I've said Isaac, Jacob. I've got to make sure that that bloodline remains all the way to the Messiah can be born. He needs time, and he is very creative in how he gets things done. And I'm going to share you with something here a little bit later that I just learned by just studying this so I could prepare it tonight. So anyhow, we'll get to that in a moment. We're in Genesis chapter 38. Now we're going to take a little sidestep here. We're going to move from Joseph being the person of most interest throughout these chapters. Now we're going to move to Judah. Now Judah was one of Jacob's son, not his firstborn. And at the time of Judah, so we got Judah and Tamar. Now Tamar is Judah's stepdaughter. And we'll learn this here as we go through. So let's just read the record. And at the time, Judah went down from his brothers and visited a certain Adulamite whose name was Hirah. So he takes a step away from probably the drama that's going on in his family. Here he's got his dad who cannot be consoled. He and his brothers have lied to a man they love. And that's got to be a very uncomfortable situation. So don't know why he went, but he did. So he goes down over to, since he went to an Adulamite, the town is called Adullam, which is, I think they said about 12 miles maybe away from where they were. So let me bring up a picture here. Let me see if sometimes this doesn't work, but I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to pop this up. Okay, can you guys see a map? If so, just put a thumbs up. Thumbs down. Okay, that's what I thought. All righty, so hang on here. I'm going to have to stop sharing. This is how this really works. I don't know why some of these things work differently here, but I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And whoops, I'm going to stop sharing. And then I'm going to open this map. And I'm going to share. And I think this is going to fix it. I hope it does. Okay, now I can't see you, but it looks like you can see this map. So I'm going to assume that's okay. If it's not okay, you can say so. Otherwise, it's okay. All right, so here is Adullam. Now, what's familiar on this map to you? Well, Hebron is, right? Because that's where they've been spending so much time. And then they traveled up to where they are now. And then they traveled even farther to Adullam. And this is, you can see
AJ,
Bethlehem.
can you make it a little larger?
There we go. There we go.
There we go. Thank you.
You bet. So we got Hebron down here, Mamre, who was buried there? Abraham, right? And you can see here some of the cities that we looked at on the Bible Lens tour, and I've shared even in these Genesis teaching. There's Bethlehem and there's Jerusalem. So you're getting a feel. This is where Adullam was, and this is where Judah went. So I want to just get a perspective. It's always great to see these maps because this is reality, and this is where these people actually went, and it's good just to be able to see that. Now I'm back into Genesis. And so he went to visit a certain Adulamite whose name was Hirah. Now Judah saw there, now you have to watch the words here because I got this mixed up the first few times I read it. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shula. So he didn't see Shula, he saw her daughter. So it's interesting though, she's not named. He sees the daughter of a Canaanite. The Canaanite mother's name is Shula, and he took this daughter, he took her as a wife and went into her. And so, and she conceived and bore a son. And so This is a Canaanite. So we see that, remember, Abraham was real concerned about Isaac, who he married, and he sent off to Haran to get someone from his family. And then Isaac was concerned, and so he went off and got Rebecca and all these different people. So we had, but now they're not so concerned. So they're beginning to marry locals, Canaanites. And as you know, we have read that there's a problem with the Canaanites in that they have many gods, and that's not a good thing. They have different culture, they're different. And so he marries this particular woman, and he took her as a wife and went into her, and she conceived. So now we're going to talk about the children of Judah. So we don't know why he went to Adullamite, but we're kind of thinking maybe the drama was too intense and his father is mourning, so he went on down. So a very important insight that Genesis 38 offers is, think about this. If God would have just let things be, Judah, and we're going to learn that his brothers marry Canaanites. And what's going to happen is the Canaanites have no problem marrying the children of Jacob, his sons, those things, that's no problem. But can you see that eventually the potential is that they would just become integrated with the Canaanite culture? Their bloodlines would be mixed and there'd be a problem. So let's see how this develops here. Their children would have probably taken wives from the area, which would have been Canaanites, and the distinction in the bloodline would disappear. Now the situation dramatically changes when Jacob and his sons go to Egypt. Now they're going to go, and we're going to see this later on. So I'm going to jump ahead and then I'm going to come back. But I want you to see the significance here while we take this little detour. It's to show how God intervenes to protect his bloodline. On surface, you won't think about this necessarily, but think about it. When you think about that happening, and then when they go to Egypt, it's interesting because while they were there, during their captivity, the Israelites married among themselves, each other. And they grew into a large nation. Apparently, it seems the Egyptian culture was very xenophobic. They didn't want to be mixed with these Israelites. They wanted to be Egyptians in their bloodlines. They're very particular about bloodlines. And so it was perfect for God's plan. So when they went to Egypt, they grew into a large nation. The bloodlines were maintained within themselves. We know that relationships, marriage among certain relatives was fine. And that's what happened. They became a large nation. And while they're in captivity, eventually Moses comes on the scene and they leave Egypt. And what did they do in Canaan? They conquered it. It took time. We have Moses and we have Joshua, we had King David, we have Hezekiah. Others finally conquered Canaan and replaced the inhabitants with Israelites. So you can see God's hand in this and his plan taking the time to accomplish his goal. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So Judah is now having children. So Judah has married the Canaanite woman whose name we don't know. We just know her mom's name. She conceived and bore a son, and his name was Er. And then she conceived again and bore another son. His name was Onan. And she conceived again and gave birth and named him. Now, this is a guy. I know in today's, Sheilas are considered girls now, especially if you're in Australia. But here, Sheila is normally, I think, a girl's name. But this is a guy. And it was and he gave the town where this Jezib is where she gave birth. So now we've got Judah. He's got 3 sons, right? Okay. He's got 3 sons. Let's continue. Now this gets interesting here, and sometimes it's hard to explain, but this is what happened. Judah took a wife for his firstborn. So her name was Tamar. So Judah gets a wife for his first son. Her name's Tamar. Judah's firstborn, was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. So Yahweh put him to death. What did he do? The Bible is silent, but you can bet it was a grave offense. So he ends up dying. So the culture was, and this is very common, I'm going to show you some records here. When a man dies, his brother comes in and performs the duty to have children. So Judah said to Onan, this had been his second born, go into your brother's wife, this is Tamar, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law and raise up seed for your brother. So was Judah's first, he died, and it was a custom when a man died, brother would be required to marry her to raise offspring for the brother that died. It would be as if himself had fathered this child. This is how they would look at the son from the brother. He would have the same rights as if he had fathered by the dead husband. In this case, we're talking about So we'll read more about this tradition later on in the Old Testament, but we've read about it in an example that the Sadducees gave to Jesus. Taking a dead brother's wife was common. Not only would she have children, but the good thing is this would allow her to have children and she would have provision. Oftentimes women, if they did not have husbands, they were left to prostitution, abuse, starvation, because the men were able to protect them, and that was their culture, and that's the way it was. And so it was a good thing, even though it seems a little bit strange to us. It was good, and it was actually set up as it's called a Levite marriage, a Levite marriage. So let's take a look at when this is first it was practiced, but is actually written into law in Deuteronomy chapter 25. In Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 5, it says, now this is preserving the family line in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5. If brothers live together and one of them dies but has no son, the wife of the dead is to be married outside the family to a stranger, not to be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother is to go into her and take her to himself as a wife and perform the duties of a husband's brother to be. Now it is to be that the firstborn whom she bears will carry the name of his father's dead brother, so that his name is not blotted out of Israel. So that was written into law later, but it was being practiced at this time. So this is the situation here. So his brother, Onan, takes her to be a wife, but then we get some peculiar behavior. Matter of fact, before I go on, this Levite marriage actually is where we get the name brother-in-law. It's different now because a brother-in-law is, you know what a brother-in-law is, but then it had a different meaning. So I did want to, I'm going to slip back here really quick to Deuteronomy because I left out this one part that's important. So if there's a situation now, so in the next word, but if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, this is in verse 7 of Deuteronomy 25 is where I went back to, then his brother's wife is to go up to the gate of the city to the elders and say, my husband brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city are to call him, speak to him, and if he stands there and says, I do not want to take her, then the brother's wife is to approach him in the presence of the elders, take off her sandal from his foot and spit in his face. Then she is to answer and say, this is what is done to the man who does not build up the house of his brother. And his name is to be called in Israel, the house of him who has his sandal taken off. So the man was disgraced. He could refuse to do it, but there was no capital punishment. It was just, he was disgraced. And that's how that went. It's kind of interesting law, but I didn't want to leave off that second part because we're going to see how this is important as we go through the record. So now Onan, so here's number 2, the second-born son, knew that his seed would not be his. So he's concerned about taking his brother's wife. and he knew that the child wouldn't be him. He didn't like it. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his semen on the ground in order not to give seed to his brother. What an odd thing. But that's what the record says. So God didn't like it. But what he did was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. So God put him to death also, just like his older brother. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, and we're going to try to unpack some of this stuff because this is kind of interesting. So, why did not Onan want to have sons through Tamar? We're still talking about Tamar. Now, if you think about it, I've looked at some other, I've read some stuff. What could this be? Why would this be a big deal? Well, if he knew it was his, it could be, and this is speculation, is that he would be as if he would be as if was his son and he would be entitled to the inheritance. So then the inheritance would be split with this new child that was born plus Onan and Sheila. So that's one thought. Maybe that's why. Maybe there's another reason. We don't know. But in any case, he wasn't going to do it. And then it ends up dying. Now there's some speculation here, and it's kind of interesting. If you look at this, it's not, even the REV commentary does not address. You can see that 10 is kind of a gray. That means there's no commentary on it. The red ones mean there is commentary. But what he did was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. So what was it that he did? Was it the act of wasting his semen and not impregnating his brother, or was there other stuff? Now when we looked at the Levitical law, it was not a capital punishment crime for what he did as far as not raising seed. He could say no, and he could be disgraced, but here he dies. So it leaves something to ponder would be, was there something else? Was there something else he did? So I'm not sure that the evil that Onan died of was because he didn't impregnate his dead brother's wife. It seems that there must or may have been something more grievous offense. But if we take it literally, it says what it says, and that is the evil was wasting his semen on the ground to not give seed to his brother. So something you can ponder about. So Genesis, we move on to Genesis 38:11. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, he's now lost two sons. That had to be a horrendous thing for Judah. Remain a widow in your father's house until Sheila, my son, has grown up. So apparently Sheila's too young to get married. And so so he sends her back to her parents, her dad's house. So this is interesting here, because for he said to himself, this is what Judah is saying. Otherwise, otherwise he may also die like his brothers. He didn't want to lose all of his sons. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Okay, so this is the plan. Sheila is not old enough to get married. He, according to their tradition, was two, but he was too young. So he sends her off to wait till Sheila gets older. Now, after many days, Sheila's daughter, the wife of Judah, why is she not named? I don't know, but God didn't name her. Now, after many days, Sheila's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. So now Judah is now a widower. He is not married. So when Judah was comforted, he went up to the sheep shearers in Timnah, he and his friend Hurrah, the Adullamite. We just read about him a few verses ago. So when Judah was comforted, it said that maybe this was after the time of mourning. Maybe, but that would seem to be an awful long time as we read the rest of the record. We'll see. But anyhow, that's what he did. He went up there, and that's what it says in verse 12 there. So all this stuff is very transparent. God's showing exactly what's going on as much as he wants us to know, and a lot of it is pretty wild. In verse 13, and it was told to Tamar. So now Tamar is with her dad in her dad's house, saying, behold, your father-in-law, we're talking about Judah now, is going up to Timnah to shear sheep. So she gets word. So she took off her clothes, the clothes she wore as a widow. Apparently, widow clothes was what's being worn. And this is kind of not uncommon in the culture. Sometimes a widow would wear different clothing and covered herself with a veil so you can see who she was, and wrapped herself and sat in the gate of Enaim that is on the road to Timnah. This is where Judah was going. So she takes off her widower's clothes and she basically disguises herself. And she's kind of upset because for she saw that Sheila was grown up, that she had not been given to him as a wife. So what's going on here? You can see that there's a little bit of tension here, and you can kind of tell that, this is a sore subject for Judah because he lost two sons and he kind of sends her off to her dad, and maybe he's trying to forget the whole matter. But anyhow, she didn't. And she knows that Sheila is old enough, but she didn't have him as a husband. So she gets all dressed up and she goes down here on the road to Timnah, which because she knows is Judah's going to be on the road to Timnah. And when Judah saw her, she's at the gate here. Everybody sees everybody because you have to go through the gate and get in a city. So that's, if you want to be seen, that's where you go. And when Judah saw her, he didn't know who she was. He thought she was a prostitute because she'd covered her face. Well, look at this. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, well, here now, let me come into you, because he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. So she said, what will you give me so that you may come into me? They're working out a deal. What are you going to pay for this service? Amazing stuff that God shows us here. And she said, well, and he said, I'll give you a young goat from the flock. So he wants to pay for her sexual services with a young goat from the flock. And she said, well, will you give me a pledge? How do I know I'm going to get this young goat? So she's tries a hard bargain, but she's a smart girl here. And we'll see how smart she is later on. Will you give me a pledge until you send it? And he said to her, what pledge should I give you? And she said, oh, your seal and your cord and your staff. Well, the seal was they had a stone and they had some kind of engraving in there. So when he would press this on some wax or whatever, it was kind of like a signature. It was like the seal of Judah. This means he signed this, so to speak. And there was a cord that held the stone around his neck, and a staff. Now, a staff could have been very much personalized, some engraving. So he would know it was his staff, and others who knew him and his stuff would know it's his staff. And so it's really of no high value. It's just a stone and a staff and a cord. So he gives it to her and he went into her. So they agreed to the agreement, and she conceived by him. Oh my gosh. So Judah is having sex with his daughter-in-law. He doesn't know it, and he's unmarried, so he's not committing adultery, but he is having sex with his daughter-in-law. And that's just the truth of it, the cold, hard truth. So as we continue, she arose and she went away and probably back to her father's house, took off her veil, and she goes back and puts on her widow clothes again. So this is what happened. We get the details here. Let me check. Okay, so now we're in verse 20. So we're moved into verse 20 here. And Judah sent the young goat. I'm going to wrap this up here. Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend, this Adulamite. You just read about him. And to get the pledge back from the woman's hand that but he did not find her. So he wanted his stone back and the cord and the staff, and he's coming through. He's making an effort to pay her because he said he would, and that's what she is supposed to keep. And then he asked the men at her place, saying, "Where's this temple prostitute who was beside the road and at the gate there in Enaim?" But they said, "No temple prostitute has been here," and that must have been disturbing. What do you mean? So Judah. So he returns, the guy, I think his name starts with the H. comes back to and talks to Judah. He says, I didn't find her. And also the men of the place said, no temple prostitute has been here. So he's scratching his head. So Judah said, well, let her keep them. You know, that's a stone, the cord, and the staff for herself. Otherwise, we will be viewed with contempt. You know, I can't go back. And what am I going to do? So behold, I sent this young goat, but could not find her. So I tried to make the deal right. I can't find her. So she gets to keep the stuff. So now we'll get into verse 24. Now, about 3 months later, after Judah was told, 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has committed prostitution. And moreover, look, she's pregnant by prostitution. So Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. So he's upset that his daughter-in-law has gone out and gotten pregnant by someone other than who she should have been, which should have been Sheila. But he's just kind of, he doesn't have a clue right now what's going on. He hasn't put it together. But she, in verse 25, as she was being brought out, she sent to her father-in-law saying, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And guess what she sends out? She also said, please identify these, who these are. The seal, the cord, and the staff. Caught him red-handed. My gosh, she's about to get burned, and now Judah finds out that he's the guy who had sex with his daughter-in-law. And so in verse 26, and Judah identified them. So, yep, those are mine. And he says, she is more righteous than I am because I did not give her Sheila, my son. And he knew her again no more. So he's not going to have any intercourse with her again. So interesting story. So that's what happened. And this is, we're all talking about, we're in the bloodlines of the Messiah, and God's working through this. I don't know if he's holding his nose while this stuff is going on. And maybe he just has this wonderful tolerance for people, knowing he has a goal in mind and he's going to get there. And when the time came for her birth in verse 27, behold, twins were born in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one of them sticks his hand out, and the midwife ties a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But the hand goes back in verse 29, when he drew back his hand, and behold, the brother came out. So the one who actually is born first isn't the firstborn, because the other one got his hand out first. And that's a big deal. You know, firstborn sons were a big deal. And what a breach you have made for yourself. So his name was Perez. So guess what the word Perez means? It means breach. So they named him because he stuck his hand out like that. And afterward, his brother came out, the one who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was Sarah. So we got Perez ends up being considered the firstborn because his hand went out first. And here's the interesting thing about Perez. Now it's interesting, they're twins because Jacob and Esau were twins. And they had this kind of deal when they were born. The heel snatcher was holding one, but it's just kind of interesting. There seems to be a parallel. I don't know the significance, but let me show you something here about Perez. Let's take a quick look in, we're going to wrap up here in Ruth. Let's take a quick look in Ruth. And we're going to go to Ruth 4. And we're going to talk about, this is where Naomi and Ruth, actually Ruth ends up being in part of the believer's line. So let's look here. Now, these are the generations of Perez. So we just talked Perez's birth. Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Aminadab, and Aminadab was the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon was the father of Salmon, and Salmon was the father of Boaz, and Boaz was the father of Obed, and Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. And we know David is believer's line. So Perez is actually, the believer's line went through Perez, who was Judah's, actually became Judah's son through his daughter-in-law, Tamar. What an interesting thing. So what we have here is the Messiah is both a descendant of the Canaanite woman Tamar and Ruth up here, who's also here. The woman, her neighbors gave him a name. Well, I won't go into that record, but also Ruth is involved. So we have a Moabite woman and a Canaanite woman. Both are involved with the genealogy of our Messiah. So interesting account. I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll continue on with the records in the Bible where we're talking about these great truths here that are very interesting and sometimes, wow, you know. So we'll continue our study next Thursday. But Heavenly Father, thank you for your love, your goodness, your grace, your mercy. Thank you for how you show us all the behind the scenes stuff. Help us to see the fullness of what you're doing. We get the idea how you had to protect your bloodline and they would not be all corrupted by the marriages within Canaan. You took them away and kept them and brought them back out of Egypt. So thank you for your wisdom, your long suffering for us, and your forbearance, your goodness, and your kindness. For a wonderful night tonight. Thank you for the weekend coming up. Bless this group tonight with good rest, good sleep, peace, health, and guidance and forgiveness. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. Amen.